Marie Antoinette's execution was far more brutal than history lets on. The year was 1789 and France was a country on fire. The streets of Paris echoed with unrest, with the cries of the poor and hungry blending into the rumble of anger against the monarchy. Bread had become a luxury that most could not afford. People whispered in fear and anger about the Queen, Marie Antoinette, blaming her for the suffering they endured. They called her extravagant, careless, and even cruel. To them, she was the Austrian queen who had come to ruin France. Yet beneath the whispers and the hatred, Marie was only a woman, a mother, a wife, and a human being trapped in a gilded cage of her own making.
Marie Antoinette had once known nothing but wealth and privilege.
Born in Austria, she was raised in grand palaces with gilded mirrors and glittering chandeliers. Every room seemed to sparkle with light. Every meal a feast, every day a celebration of luxury. She had been taught etiquette, music, and dance, trained to move with grace and speak with precision. She had learned that appearances mattered above all, that the world would judge her not for her thoughts, but for how she wore her dresses, how she smiled, and how she carried herself. She was the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, and from the moment she could remember, life had been full of expectations, beauty, and rules. At 15, she was sent to France to marry the future King Louis XVI. The journey was long and filled with nerves, but she held her head high. She understood that her role was larger than herself. She was now Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, the embodiment of royalty in a land where tradition demanded obedience and respect. The early years were difficult. The court at Versailles was a maze of rules, jealousies, and intrigue. Every gesture, every glance, every word could become a weapon in the delicate politics of the palace. Yet Marie had charm and intelligence, and slowly she learned to navigate this treacherous world. Despite her adaptation to palace life, the people of France remained distant, and soon they grew to resent her. Rumors spread faster than sunlight, painting her as a woman who cared only for jewels and silk, ignoring the suffering of the people. Stories of her lavish spending on gowns, parties, and hairpieces became fuel for the growing anger outside Versailles' gates. She was called names meant to wound and humiliate, though the truth was far more complicated. Marie Antoinette was young, curious, and often lonely. She wanted to enjoy life within the limits of her royal duties, but she also loved her children fiercely and often worried for their future. Her private letters revealed her fear for her family, the sleepless nights thinking of what might happen to them, and the sadness she felt knowing that so many in her kingdom suffered. In the summer of 1789, the tension boiled over. News came that the Bastille had been stormed, a symbol of the people's rebellion against tyranny. France was no longer calm. It was a country shaking with fear, anger, and the desire for change. Marie watched from the windows of Versailles as the world she knew began to crumble. She feared for her family, for herself, and for the life she had known. The palace that once seemed eternal and safe now felt fragile, a gilded cage surrounded by storms. Guards whispered warnings. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones of revolutionaries and riots. Every step outside the palace gates was now dangerous. Every glance from a stranger could hide judgment or malice. She began to understand that the image of Marie Antoinette, the queen who spent freely, laughed too loudly, and wore dresses made of diamonds, had become a mask. The woman behind it was frightened, aware of the power she had lost, and uncertain of what was to come. The queen's daily life changed. Meals became tense, filled with careful observation of who might be loyal and who might betray. Her conversations were measured, every word chosen to avoid offense. Even her children, Louis Joseph, Louis Charles, and Marie Thérèse, became reminders of the fragile state of her family's safety. She held them close, taught them songs and stories, tried to preserve moments of childhood innocence amid the chaos. In her private chambers, away from the prying eyes of courtiers, she allowed herself to cry quietly, to pray, and to wonder if she would survive the storms that had overtaken France. Outside Versailles, the people's anger grew sharper each day. Posters, pamphlets, and gossip painted Marie as a villain, exaggerating her luxuries and accusing her of crimes she had never committed.
Some claimed she plotted against the revolution, that she spent the country's money on feasts while families starved.
Others spread stories of her supposed cruelty towards servants and children in the palace. The truth was far simpler. She was a woman trying to survive in a world that had turned against her. Yet these stories fueled the fire, making her a symbol of everything that the revolutionaries hated. People spoke of her with rage, as if she alone was responsible for the suffering they endured. The anger was no longer just political. It had become personal. Marie Antoinette was feared, hated, and blamed for sins she did not commit. As months passed, the revolution gained strength. The royal family was no longer safe within the walls of Versailles. Marie felt the world tightening around her like a noose. Every day she watched soldiers patrol the grounds. Every day she wondered who might turn against them next. She saw families torn apart, friends vanish, and courtiers arrested. She had grown accustomed to a life of control and certainty, but now she had none. Her heart ached for her children, who were too young to understand the danger, yet old enough to sense the tension that filled the palace. Marie knew that soon they would have to leave Versailles, perhaps forever, and she worried about the hardships they would face. Then came the day when the royal family was forced to leave their palace and move to Paris. The journey was long and uncomfortable. Crowds lined the streets, shouting insults and throwing stones. Marie clutched her children, trying to shield them from the chaos. Her heart pounded with fear, not for herself alone, but for the little lives she had brought into a world that suddenly felt cruel and unforgiving. As they arrived in Paris, the people's hatred was tangible. She saw faces twisted with anger, heard voices crying for justice and revenge. It was clear that her life as a queen was ending, and the life as a prisoner of history had begun. Paris. The family was confined to the Tuileries Palace. The walls, once symbols of luxury and power, now felt like the bars of a cage. Marie watched the streets below, knowing that every step outside could bring danger. Guards surrounded them, not for protection, but for control. The queen began to understand the depth of the hatred she faced. Letters from supporters offered little comfort. The revolution had changed the rules of survival. She had once been untouchable, surrounded by wealth, advisors, and loyalty. Now she was at the mercy of a world she had once thought would protect her. Even in the Tuileries, life was a struggle. Every meal was scrutinized. Breaths, every movement watched. Marie wore her dignity like armor, but the cracks showed in moments of exhaustion or fear. She tried to maintain hope, speaking to her children, praying and holding on to the belief that good people still existed in the world. But the world outside was unkind. Reports of executions, public punishments, and the relentless growth of revolutionary power reminded her that her fate was slipping away. The crown she had worn with pride had become a symbol of everything the people hated, and soon she would pay the price for being both queen and human. At night, when the city slept uneasily, Marie Antoinette would sit by her window, watching shadows stretch across the streets of Paris. She remembered the grandeur of Versailles, the laughter of her friends, and the quiet moments of happiness she had once known. She wondered if she would ever see those days again. She feared the moments to come, knowing that she had no control over the events that would soon decide her life. Breaths. And yet, despite fear and uncertainty, she tried to hold herself upright, reminding herself of her love for her children, her devotion to her family, and the dignity that had carried her through so many challenges before. The days passed slowly. The queen felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. She was no longer just a person. She had become a symbol, a target, and a cautionary tale. Breath. Every whisper outside the palace walls, every angry shout from the streets reminded her that the life she had known was gone. She could see now that the path ahead was one of suffering, isolation, and unimaginable trials. Marie Antoinette understood that the world would remember her as a queen, but it might never see her as a human being who had loved, feared, and hoped, just like anyone else. And so, as the sun set over Paris, Marie Antoinette sat quietly in her chamber, holding the hands of her children, staring out at the streets, filled with anger and preparing herself for a journey she could not escape. He glances around in despite. She did not know the horrors that awaited her, nor how the world would later remember her death. All she knew was that her life, once filled with wealth, joy, and freedom, had been reduced to waiting, watching, and fearing what the next day might bring.
She was trapped between history and destiny, and the story of her final years was only just beginning.
Little did she know that her fall from grace would be swift, and that the execution she would face in the future would be far more brutal than history would ever reveal. The queen, who had once danced in grand halls, now awaited the storm that would sweep away her life, dignity, and freedom. She was no longer just Marie Antoinette the queen. She was Marie Antoinette the prisoner, and the world outside was ready to decide her fate. Marie Antoinette's arrival at the conciergerie prison was a moment of quiet dread, though no one could have imagined the fear that gripped her heart. The walls of the palace in Paris, which had once offered a form of safety, now felt like the edge of a dark cliff. She was no longer a queen moving freely among courtiers. She was a prisoner, confined by stone walls and iron bars. Stripped of her titles and authority, guards guided her through narrow corridors, their faces impassive, showing neither pity nor malice. They did not speak to her, but their silence carried weight. Every echo of her footsteps reminded her that the life she had known was gone. The cell assigned to her was small and bare. A single bed, a hard chair, and a thin blanket were all that separated her from the cold stone floor. The air smelled of dampness and fear, a scent she would come to associate with her imprisonment. Outside her cell, the sounds of other prisoners whispered of suffering and desperation. Some cried quietly, others shouted in anger. Marie could hear every sob, every whispered complaint. She had left behind the grandeur of Versailles, the soft carpets and warm hearths, and now faced a world where comfort was absent and survival was uncertain.
At first, she tried to maintain her composure. She dressed herself with care, trying to retain the dignity that had defined her public life.
But it was impossible to ignore the harsh reality. Her meals were minimal, the company scarce, and her guards indifferent. She could no longer rely on advisors, servants, or friends to guide her through difficult decisions. Even her children were separated from her for much of the day, sent to rooms under guard to ensure their safety but also to strip her of the comfort of their presence. Each separation pierced her heart, a reminder that she was being slowly removed from everything she loved. The days passed slowly in the damp and shadowed halls of the conciergerie. Time itself seemed different behind prison walls, marked not by sunlight or the ringing of bells, but by the routine steps of guards and the occasional sound of a door slamming somewhere in the building. Marie spent much of her time pacing, sitting quietly by the window, or writing letters she would never send. She thought of her children constantly, praying for their safety and trying to reassure herself that she was doing everything possible to protect them. Her letters to them were filled with love, yet also with sorrow, as she could not promise the world would remain kind to them. The prison was not just a place of confinement, it was a place of judgment and fear. But guards were not cruel, but they were strict. Every movement was watched. Even the smallest lapse in behavior could result in punishment. The queen, once accustomed to commanding respect and obedience, now had to obey quietly. But she could not speak freely, could not trust anyone, and could not predict the intentions of those around her. Friends and supporters were forced to leave, leaving her isolated. Desk. Basically that any display of weakness could be noticed and used against her. Despite the hardship, Marie tried to maintain some semblance of routine. She bathed when she could, read small books that were allowed, and spoke quietly to her attendants. Occasionally she received visitors, family members or a few loyal supporters. But these meetings were brief and fraught with tension. Each visit reminded her of the world beyond the prison walls and how unreachable it had become. She observed the people around her carefully, trying to discern who was trustworthy, who might offer comfort, and who might report her words back to the revolutionary authorities. Every smile was measured, every word carefully chosen. Her health began to deteriorate under the strain of imprisonment. The food was insufficient, and the cold, damp air of the cell made her vulnerable to illness. Sleepless nights became common as fear and anxiety prevented rest. She found herself staring at the walls for hours, thinking of her children, her husband, and the life she had lost. The queen who had once danced in the glittering halls of Versailles now sat shivering in silence, her body weakened, her spirit tested. Yet even in these moments of despair, she refused to give in to hopelessness. The revolutionary authorities prepared for her trial, and the thought of facing the tribunal filled Marie with dread. She knew the process would not be fair. It was designed to humiliate and condemn her rather than to seek truth or justice. Yet she tried to steel herself, rehearsing responses, imagining questions, and preparing for the moments when she would need to speak in defense of herself. Every night she prayed for courage, for clarity, and for the strength to face what was coming. But she understood that words alone might not save her. But she could at least try to maintain dignity and grace. Meanwhile, the outside world remained relentless. Crowds gathered, discussing her fate with fervor. Revolutionary pamphlets painted her as a villain, accusing her of extravagance, treachery, and even conspiracy against France. Each story exaggerated the truth, twisting events into narratives meant to fuel anger. Marie was aware of these tales, though she had little way to respond. She realized that her reputation, once carefully cultivated through fashion, manners, and public appearances, was now beyond repair. The world no longer saw the woman behind the crown. They saw only the symbol of what they hated. Even small moments of comfort in prison were tinged with anxiety. Guards brought food, but she never knew if it was safe, if it would be withheld, or if some hidden cruelty awaited. Attendants were present but kept their distance. Marie often had to eat alone, a luxury she had never known in Versailles, where meals had been communal and full of conversation. She missed the warmth of her family, the laughter of children, and the familiarity of home. The loneliness was a constant companion, a shadow that reminded her of the power she had lost. Yet even in the bleakest moments, Marie found ways to nurture hope. But she spoke to her children when she could, taught them lessons in reading and manners, and encouraged them to be brave.
She remembered her own childhood in Austria, the lessons of resilience her mother had taught her, and drew strength from those memories.
But she prayed for guidance, sometimes through tears, sometimes with a quiet determination that surprised even herself.
The queen, once accustomed to grandeur and authority, was learning the deeper strength of patience, endurance, and courage.
The psychological toll of imprisonment was as significant as the physical.
Marie had to contend with fear, uncertainty, and constant observation.
Guards moved in patterns, watching her routines, while others whispered rumors and threats. She had to remain composed at all times, knowing that any emotional display could be misinterpreted or used against her. Even moments of solitude were tinged with tension. The prison had become a world where nothing could be taken for granted. The queen's identity was stripped down to its essence: a mother, a human being, and a prisoner. Throughout this time, Marie often reflected on the contrast between her past and present. She remembered the gardens of Versailles, where sunlight touched the fountains and flowers bloomed in endless colors. She remembered the music, the dances, and the warmth of friendship and love. Now, those memories felt distant, almost unreal, as she faced cold stone walls, harsh sounds, and relentless scrutiny. The prison was not just a physical space. It was a place where time seemed to stretch endlessly, magnifying every fear, every sorrow, and every memory of what had been lost. Despite the fear, she tried to maintain small acts of normalcy. She wrote letters, sometimes to friends, sometimes to her children, and sometimes to herself, to preserve her thoughts and memories. She read aloud when alone, recited prayers, and rehearsed speeches she might need during her trial. These actions were not mere routines. They were acts of defiance, reminders that she still existed as a human being, even as the world sought to reduce her to a symbol of hate and blame.
Her relationship with the guards was complicated.
They were neither her friends nor her enemies, but their presence was constant, a reminder of the new reality she faced. Some treated her with a minimal respect, recognizing her past as a queen, while others seemed indifferent to her suffering. Every interaction was measured, every word and gesture carefully considered.
She had learned that survival required attention to detail, caution, and an understanding of human nature that went far beyond the lessons of Versailles.
As the day of her trial approached, Marie's anxiety grew. She understood that the tribunal would not be fair, that her fate had already been decided by the politics of the revolution. Yet she also knew that her courage and composure could leave a lasting impression, even if the outcome was beyond her control. She prepared herself, rehearsing responses, drawing strength from memories of her family and her upbringing, and clinging to the belief that dignity was something no one could take away. The Queen's life in prison was harsh, lonely, and uncertain, but it was also a time of reflection and inner growth. She discovered reserves of patience, courage, and resilience that she had never needed in the luxury of Versailles. She faced fear and isolation daily, yet she continued to care for her children, maintain her dignity, and prepare for the public trial that would soon decide her fate.
Every day was a test, every hour a challenge, and every moment a reminder of how far her life had changed.
And so Marie Antoinette waited. She sat in her cell, listening to the footsteps outside, the whispers of prisoners, and the distant sounds of a world that had turned against her. She thought of her children, her husband, and the life she had lost. She wondered what history would remember, what the world would say about her, and whether anyone would ever understand the woman behind the crown. The days in the conciergerie passed slowly, but each one brought her closer to the trial and the final moments that would define her life. She knew the path ahead was dangerous and cruel, yet she steeled herself to face it with courage, dignity, and love for those she held most dear. The prison walls were cold and unforgiving, the guards silent and watchful, and the world outside impatient for her downfall. Marie Antoinette, once the most powerful woman in France, had become a prisoner of history, caught between her past and the fate that awaited her. She did not yet know the full horrors that lay ahead, but she understood that her life would never be the same, and that the story of her suffering had only just begun. The day of the trial arrived with a heavy air of tension. The streets of Paris were crowded, filled with people who believed they were witnessing justice. Revolutionary posters proclaimed the Queen a traitor, a symbol of everything the revolution sought to destroy. Inside the tribunal, the atmosphere was just as charged, but in a different way. The room was solemn, cold, and filled with officials who had already decided her fate. Marie Antoinette, dressed in plain clothes that barely disguised her royal past, was led into the chamber with her head held high. She knew that the trial would not be fair, that truth would matter little, and that the verdict had likely been written long before she entered the room.
As she took her place, the Queen's mind raced.
She tried to remember the lessons of her upbringing, the composure her mother had taught her, and the strength she had discovered during months in prison. This was not Versailles, where courtiers whispered polite advice and guards obeyed her command. This was a place where every word could be twisted, every gesture observed and judged. The officials looked at her without warmth, some with suspicion, some with barely hidden contempt. The queen understood that the stakes were life and death, not only for her but for her family and her children. The charges against her were serious, though often exaggerated or false. She was accused of conspiring with foreign enemies, of planning to overthrow the revolution, and of wasting the wealth of France while the people starved. Some claims were based on rumors, others on political documents designed to implicate her regardless of the truth. Marie knew the accusations were unlikely to convince any impartial listener, but there was no impartiality here. The tribunal had one goal: to destroy her reputation and ensure the people saw her as guilty. From the first question, Marie's voice remained steady, though inside her heart pounded. Birth. She answered carefully, calmly, refusing to let anger or fear show. When asked about her spending, she explained the demands of royal life, the ceremonies and the duties she had performed as queen. When accused of plotting against France, she denied the claims firmly, insisting that she had always wished for peace and the well-being of her people. Yet each answer was interrupted by the officials. Each denial met with suspicion, and each explanation twisted into evidence of guilt. The trial was a spectacle, not a search for truth. Witnesses appeared, some coerced, some unreliable, some motivated by anger or ambition. They testified against her, often exaggerating details or presenting half-truths as fact. One claimed she had tried to secretly contact foreign powers. Another said she spent fortunes while children went hungry. Marie listened, holding herself together as accusations mounted. Pit. Every lie, every false claim cut like a blade. But she refused to cry out, refused to show despair. She knew that any sign of weakness could be seen as confirmation of guilt. Outside the courtroom, the streets were no less charged. Crowds gathered, some shouting for justice, others simply curious. Revolutionary leaders understood the power of public opinion, and they made sure the people believed the queen was guilty. Posters, newspapers, and pamphlets had painted a picture of a cruel, selfish woman, and the trial reinforced that image. Marie could feel the weight of judgment pressing on her, not just from the officials in the room, but from every person who believed her guilty. She felt the tension of history itself, pressing down on her shoulders, reminding her that she was more than a woman. She was a symbol. Despite the fear, Marie found moments of strength. She remembered her children, imagining their faces, their voices, and the moments she had shared with them in prison. She thought of the lessons her mother had taught her in Austria, about courage, resilience, and dignity.
She drew from those memories to keep her composure, speaking clearly and politely even when the officials sought to humiliate her.
She refused to be a victim in the way they wanted. She would show that even in the face of injustice she remained herself. The questioning continued for hours, each accusation sharper than the last. Marie spoke of her intentions for peace, of her devotion to her family, and of her commitment to France despite the misunderstandings and false reports that surrounded her. She tried to convey sincerity, but the court was not listening for truth. Every statement was weighed for weakness, every gesture noted as potential evidence against her. The queen realized that logic, reason, and honesty were powerless here. Only perception mattered.
As the trial drew on, the emotional strain became nearly unbearable. Marie was tired, her body weak from months of confinement, her mind strained from constant scrutiny.
Yet she refused to break. She refused to cry, to plead desperately, or to beg for mercy. Instead, she held her dignity as her shield, drawing strength from the knowledge that even if the court condemned her, she could control how she faced the verdict.
She remembered that the world would watch, and even in chains, she could show courage.
Finally, after hours of questioning, the tribunal announced the verdict. Marie Antoinette was found guilty of treason and other crimes against the people of France. The sentence was death by guillotine, swift and irreversible. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. Marie listened quietly, her heart heavy, but her posture unbroken. Breaths. She knew that the sentence meant she would soon face the ultimate test of courage. She had survived months of fear, isolation, and public hatred, but the end was now certain. Her fate was sealed. Even as the officials delivered the sentence, Marie's thoughts turned to her children. She worried for their safety, their future, and how they would remember her. She hoped they would understand that her actions had always been guided by love, that her devotion to them had never wavered. She tried to memorize their faces, the way their eyes reflected hope, trust, and innocence. She whispered quiet prayers for them, asking that they be protected, that they grow to live full and meaningful lives despite the chaos surrounding them. The Queen was led from the courtroom back to her cell, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She felt sorrow for what she was leaving behind, fear for what was to come, and a strange sense of resignation. The guards walked beside her without speaking, their silence heavy with the knowledge of what awaited. Marie understood that she had entered a world where her past, titles, wealth, and privileges no longer mattered. But she was now a prisoner of history, judged not by her actions, but by the anger and fear of the masses. In her cell, she took a moment to collect herself. She wrote letters, as she had done before, to her children and friends. Each word was filled with love and hope, though tinged with sadness. Breaths. She tried to prepare herself for the ordeal ahead, rehearsing the moments on the scaffold in her mind.
She imagined holding herself with dignity, even in the face of death.
Breaths. She knew that this would be the ultimate challenge, not only to survive physically, but to remain herself in a world that sought to strip her of identity and humanity. The hours before her execution were long and filled with anxious waiting. Guards brought her food, though she ate little, her mind consumed by thoughts of the coming day. She tried to rest, but sleep was elusive. Every sound outside her cell, every footstep, every distant cry reminded her of the reality she could not escape. She clutched her hands together, whispered prayers, and tried to summon the courage that had carried her through months of confinement and public scrutiny. Marie's reflection in the mirror revealed a woman transformed. Her face was pale, her hair worn thin, and her body frail. Yet her eyes retained a spark, a quiet determination that had not been extinguished by the trials she had faced. The Queen who had once dazzled the court with her beauty and fashion now faced her mortality with courage and composure. The power she had wielded in Versailles was gone, but the strength of her character remained. Even as the world outside demanded her downfall, she resolved to meet her fate with dignity. The revolutionaries, unaware of her inner strength, prepared for her transfer to the scaffold. Crowds gathered outside, expecting a display of punishment and humiliation. They would see only the public performance of justice, not the private courage of the woman who had endured months of fear and isolation. Marie Antoinette, once a symbol of extravagance, was about to become a symbol of human endurance and quiet bravery, though the world might never fully understand the depth of her suffering. As she was led away from the conciergerie for the final time, the Queen walked steadily, though her heart pounded with fear and sorrow. Every step brought her closer to the moment history would record, but which would never fully capture the suffering, dignity, and humanity that had marked her final days. She held her head high, thinking of her children, her family, and the life that had been stolen from her. She understood that the world would see her death as swift and orderly, but the truth, the full measure of fear, exhaustion, and emotional torment would remain hidden from most. And so Marie Antoinette approached the place where history would meet her, aware that she had faced injustice, betrayal, and cruelty. She was no longer the Queen of France, no longer the symbol of wealth and power.
She was a woman, a mother, a human being, confronting the end of her life with courage and quiet defiance. The trial had ended. The verdict was clear.
and the final act of her life was about to begin.
Yet even in the shadow of death, she retained her dignity, her composure, and the love for those who remained in her heart. The morning of her execution arrived with a chilling stillness over Paris. Marie Antoinette was woken before sunrise and prepared for what she knew would be the final journey of her life. The air outside was cold, the streets quiet in the early hours, yet a sense of tension had already begun to settle. Word had spread quickly that the Queen would be led to the scaffold, and by mid-morning crowds would gather, eager to witness the punishment of the woman who had once been the most powerful in France. Marie dressed simply, in plain clothes that hid her former grandeur, and tried to calm her thoughts as the guards waited. The journey from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution was tense and filled with silent observation. Marie held her head high, her posture straight, though her heart pounded with fear and sorrow. She thought of her children, Louis Charles, Marie Therese, and the memories of Louis Joseph, and the people she loved who were no longer by her side. Every step was heavy, yet she moved with grace, refusing to let the fear she felt show to the world. The streets along the route were lined with people, their faces eager, angry, and curious. Some shouted, some laughed, and some simply stared. The Queen felt the weight of history pressing down upon her, knowing that the eyes of all France were upon her. The scaffold itself was a stark and unwelcoming sight. The guillotine loomed above, a machine of both efficiency and terror. Soldiers surrounded the platform, ensuring order, yet the air was electric with expectation. Marie stepped onto the wooden steps slowly, feeling each movement as if the world had slowed around her. The guards guided her to the exact spot where her life would end. But she could see the blade above, sharp and silent, a symbol of finality that demanded respect and fear. Despite the horror, she kept her composure, holding her hands together and standing tall, a queen even in her final moments. As the execution began, Marie Antoinette's mind was a whirlwind of memories. She thought of her childhood in Austria, the lessons of resilience and courage her mother had taught her, and the long, challenging years in France. Breaths while the music she remembered, the splendor of Versailles, the music, the laughter, and the moments of happiness she had cherished. She thought of her husband, Louis XVI, and the sorrow of losing him to the Revolution. And most of all, she thought of her children, who represented hope, love, and the future she had fought to protect. These thoughts gave her a strange comfort, even as fear and sorrow pressed against her heart. The public expected a display of humiliation or fear, yet Marie maintained dignity. She did not beg, cry, or protest. Her steps were steady, her gaze focused, and her expression calm. Guards ensured she did not stumble, though the weight of her situation was almost unbearable. She was aware of the crowd, the eyes watching, the whispers spreading across Paris. Every detail mattered, yet she concentrated on the quiet strength she had nurtured during months of imprisonment. This was her moment to demonstrate courage in the face of ultimate adversity.
The execution was carried out quickly, as history records, but the full truth was harsher than most ever knew. The physical act of being prepared for the guillotine was frightening. She was bound, positioned, and made to wait in anticipation, each second stretching into eternity.
Her body trembled from cold, fear, and exhaustion. The guards' hands, though not cruel, were firm, reminding her that resistance was not an option. The spectators, eager to witness justice, had no idea of the mental torment, the helplessness, and the tension that filled those final moments. Marie's courage was tested in ways that history rarely reveals. In those final seconds, her mind raced through her life. She relived moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure, love and loss. Breaths. She remembered her first days in France, the challenges of being a young queen, the whispers of court life, and the kindnesses she had found in unexpected places. Breaths. She thought of the mistakes she had made, the misunderstandings that had led to her downfall, and the events beyond her control that had shaped her fate. Through it all, she focused on one truth. She had lived, loved, and tried to protect those she cared for most. The blade fell with swift efficiency, yet the moments leading to it were charged with tension, fear, and emotional pain. Marie had confronted death with courage, yet the human mind cannot escape instinctive fear. She had felt her pulse quicken, her chest tighten, and her thoughts race with the knowledge that the end was inevitable. Even as she faced this ultimate challenge, she did not waver in her dignity. The Queen's composure, bravery, and inner strength were perhaps the most remarkable aspects of her final moments, though they would be lost to most who witnessed the spectacle. But the crowd reacted as expected, with a mixture of relief, triumph, and curiosity. Some cheered, seeing only the symbol of royal extravagance punished at last. Others were silent, perhaps recognizing the bravery of the woman who had faced death without losing composure.
Few could understand the depth of her suffering, the months of confinement, the anxiety, and the emotional torment that had led to this final moment.
History would record the execution as swift and decisive, but the personal courage and human suffering of Marie Antoinette remained hidden behind the public spectacle. Even after death, the Queen's humanity remained visible to those who looked closely. Her last thoughts, her final expressions, and her quiet bravery revealed a woman who had endured fear, loneliness, and injustice, yet had met her fate with dignity.
She had been a mother, a wife, and a human being, not just a symbol of monarchy.
The full story of her life and death, the personal struggles, the months of imprisonment, the constant anxiety, and the strength she displayed, remained a hidden truth, known only to those who could imagine the life behind the crown. After the execution, the streets of Paris continued their activity, the crowd dispersing and returning to their daily lives. For many, the Queen's death was a form of closure, a demonstration of the power of the revolution. Yet for those who remembered her as a person rather than a symbol, there was sorrow and reflection. Marie Antoinette's story was more than politics. It was a tale of a woman who had lived in extremes of fortune and loss, who had loved deeply, and who had faced fear with courage. The simplicity of her humanity contrasted sharply with the public perception of her as a villain or a symbol of excess. Her children were left to navigate a world shaped by revolution and fear. They were separated from their mother, their understanding of her sacrifice incomplete. Marie had hoped that they would carry forward her love and resilience, that they would understand the courage required to face injustice and danger. Though she could not protect them from the full consequences of history, she had instilled in them lessons of endurance, hope, and dignity that would remain long after her passing. History would remember Marie Antoinette in simplified terms: a queen who spent too freely, a symbol of monarchy, and a figure punished by revolution. Yet the reality was far more complex. She had been a woman caught between privilege and terror, between love for her family and the hatred of the masses, between dignity and fear. Her execution was not merely an event. It was the culmination of months of emotional and physical suffering, of isolation, and of a struggle to maintain humanity in the face of unimaginable adversity. The legacy of Marie Antoinette lies not only in her mistakes or the controversies that surrounded her, but in the courage she displayed in her final days. She faced imprisonment, a sham trial, and a public execution without losing the essence of her character. Her strength was quiet, internal, and often unseen, but it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even as history simplified her story, the truth of her suffering, bravery, and maternal love remained a hidden, powerful narrative. As the city of Paris returned to its routine after her death, the memory of Marie Antoinette lingered. She had become a symbol, yes, but also a human story of courage, endurance, and dignity in the face of fear. Her life and death remind us that behind historical events, there are always personal struggles, emotions, and courage that cannot be captured in simple headlines or official records. The full reality of her execution, the fear, the loneliness, the preparation, and the human strength she displayed was far more complex and moving than history would ever reveal. In the end, Marie Antoinette's story serves as a reflection on the nature of power, injustice, and humanity. She had been Queen of France, but more importantly, she was a mother, a woman, and a human being who faced the ultimate test of courage. Her execution marked the end of her life, but the narrative of her strength, endurance, and dignity continues to inspire those who seek to understand the human experience beyond the surface of history. Even today, one can imagine her final moments, her courage, and the love she carried in her heart, reminding us that behind every historical figure lies a deeply human story. And so, the story of Marie Antoinette concludes not only with her death, but with a deeper understanding of the human being behind the crown. She faced fear and injustice, endured suffering and loneliness, and yet maintained her dignity to the end. Her life and execution were far more brutal and emotionally complex than most records suggest, and her courage remains a testament to the resilience and strength of the human spirit, echoing through history long after the crowds had gone.